Good morning, good morning. We begin today's daf. We begin by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for the year. We thank the Tilson family for sponsoring all the shiurim as chos for Restore's Torahs for Am Yisrael. We also thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of Av. We thank Stephen and Wendy Drazen for sponsoring all the shiurim and all the drashos in honor of Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, and Stanley Rosenzweig, and Eileen Rosenzweig. We also thank our sponsors for Daf Yomi for today, Jacob and Julie Blumenfeld for sponsoring today's daf, Leila Nishmas, Jacob's paternal grandfather, Ruvain Blumenfeld, Ruvain Leib Ben Meir, whose yahrzeit is today. The Neshama should have an aliyah, and the family should have a nechama. Today's daf is Avoda Zara daf Mem Tes. We are picking up on daf Mem Ches Amud Beis at the Mishnah. Mishnah starts as follows. So again, speaking about an Asherah, trees that were used for Avoda Zara, the Mishnah says, Zorin Tachteha Yerakos. You're allowed to plant vegetables underneath these trees, but says the Mishnah, only be Mosai Geshamim in the winter months, but not in the summer months. Why is that? Because in the winter months, the shade is going to cause a problem. They need all the sunlight they can possibly get, and the shade that comes from the tree is to their detriment, and therefore planting them under the tree would be perfectly fine because it's not benefiting from the tree of Avodah Zarah at all. But in the summer months, the sunny months, at that point in time, it's actually beneficial because having too much sun is going to be a problem, and therefore it is better for them to have that shade, and therefore you can't do it in the summer. Chazirin and chazaras, lettuce, lobi mosachama, lobi mosachasham. Says the Mishnah, you can't plant it under these trees, whether it is the winter or the summer. In any case, they're going to be benefiting from that shade, and therefore it's benefiting from Avodah Zara, which is a problem, so you can't do it. You can't plant chazaras, these lettuce leaves, or lettuce, underneath an Asherah tree ever. Rabbi Yossi disagrees with the Tanna Kama and says the following. Af lo yerakos b'mosai geshamim. You're not even allowed to plant these vegetables in the winter months. Why? Mipnei shehanavia nosher saleim v'hevi lahan lezevo. So he says something very interesting. He says, you're right. The actual leaves, the actual branches of the tree that are hanging over these fruits are to their detriment. It does ruin them. However, the reality is that all those leaves are going to fall down. It's the winter. They're going to fall off the tree. What happens? They start to decompose, and they turn into fertilizer. So what happens is you're going to have these vegetables growing in the ground with the fertilizer of the leaves of the Atzei Asherah. They're going to receive their nutrition and their sustenance through Atzei Asherah, and therefore it's a problem. Now the Gemara is going to immediately start a discussion of Zev Zegorem. So we'll just explain it now in the Mishnah to explain what this means. Zev Zegorem means when you have two forces that come together to produce a singular result. In other words, the result comes out. How did it get there? It got there by way of two different things bringing it out. Okay, so our Mishnah, person plants vegetables in the ground. So where do they receive the nutrition from? They receive the nutrition from the ground. The ground is not Avodah Zarah, it's just regular ground. No one served, and we explained previously, you can't even make something which is connected to the ground, or I should say part of the ground, into Avodah Zarah. So the ground is not Avodah Zarah. Where are these vegetables receiving the nutrition from? The ground, which is entirely permissible. Says Rabbi Yossi, however, don't forget you have leaves of Avodah Zarah that fall on top of them. Those leaves will decompose and turn into fertilizer, and then those vegetables will receive nutrition from those leaves. Now, what will ultimately produce the vegetable that you're going to eat? A combination of the earth, which is totally permissible, and the decomposed leaves, which is Avodah Zarah, zeh v'zeh goreb. Both of them together will join forces to produce a vegetable. Clearly, in our Mishnah, what do we see? According to Rabbi Yossi, it's a problem. If you have a force of heter, permissibility, and force of isser, which is prohibited, you put them together. Halacha is, according to Rabbi Yossi, you're not allowed to benefit from it. And this is a very big sugya in Shas, and Mr. Hashem will have an opportunity to go through some of it today, and then maybe we'll speak about some halacha l'maisa. But clearly, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi is concerned for Zev Zegorim, and the Tanna Kama is not concerned for Zev Zegorim. And Tanna Kama would say it's permissible. It's true that these leaves are going to go ahead and they're going to fall down on top of the ground and decompose and turn into fertilizer. However, they're not concerned. They say it's permissible, and the Gemara is going to explain why. Now the Gemara begins. Lememra, is it really true? Are you trying to tell me Rabbi Yossi Savar Zevezagorim Aser, Rabbanan Amri Zevezagorim Mutter? Is this really true? Is our Mishnah actually telling us, reporting to us, a true fact about the opinion of Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan? The problem is, our Mishnah indicates that Rabbi Yossi is the one who says it's problematic, and the Rabbanan, the sages, tell us that it is not a problem. However, the problem is of Ibcha Shamin Lahu. We learned elsewhere exactly the opposite. Where was this? We learned this previously in our Masechta. And what does it say? The Tanan, it says Rabbi Yossi says, if a person has a Avoda Zara, what can they do with it? Shochek v'zora l'ruach. He grinds it up and he throws it into the wind. Omat yam, or he throws it into the yam, into the ocean. The Amrullah, the Chachamim responded and said to him, Af hinas zevel. If you're going to go ahead, grind up Avoda Zara, and then just spread it out all over the place, what's going to happen? It's going to turn into fertilizer. The Nemar, the pasuk says, "Lo yidbak biyadecha me'uma min achera." You're not allowed to hold in your hand any part of Avoda Zara. What do we see over here? Exactly the opposite. Yossi is of the opinion that you could take Avoda Zara and just spread it out all over the place, and you're not concerned about it. Now let me think for a second. If I'm going to spread my Avoda Zara all over the ground, what's going to happen to it? It will decompose, it will join forces with the ground, and it's going to produce grass, it's going to produce a tree, it's going to produce vegetables, it's going to do something around which is going to have a positive benefit. And says Rabbi Yossi, no problem, I'm not concerned about that, you can still do it. What do the Chachamim respond? Say, no, you can't do that. It's going to turn into fertilizer, it's going to cause something to grow, which is exactly the opposite of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah says Rabbi Yossi is concerned for Zevezagorim. Previously, we learned Rabbi Yossi is not concerned for Zevezagorim. To make matters worse, the Chachamim of our Mishnah are not concerned for Zevezagorim, and previously they are worried about Zevezagorim. So says the Gemara, which one is it? Kasha d'Rabbanan and Rabbanan, we have a stira, a contradiction in the opinion of the Rabbanan, and Kasha d'Rabbi Yossi, we have a stira, a contradiction in the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Now, Bishlam ad Rabbi Yossi, ad Rabbi Yossi, Kasha, the Gemara says, okay, we can settle Rabbi Yossi. Why? Because there's a difference. We'll explain as follows. Bishlam ad Rabbi Yossi, ad Rabbi Yossi, lo Kasha, because Hasam dika azil li'ibud. In that case, what are you doing? You're taking Avoda Zara and you are throwing it to waste. Now, Rashi explains that what this means is that you're being the akum who's grinding this up and throwing it to the wind. He himself knows that he's destroying his Avoda Zara, and he's thereby destroying the Avoda Zara and being mevatel it. So it's true that it was Avoda Zara, but this process of grinding it up and throwing it to the wind is his way of nullifying the Avoda Zara within it. That's why, in that case, Rabbi Yossi says it's not a problem. In other words, it's not even an issue of Zevezagorim. In that issue, there's no problem with the Avoda Zara causing anything to grow because it's not Avoda Zara. In our case, though, it is a problem because the tree is still standing. The tree is perfectly still serving as an Avoda Zara, and it's a problem. So hacha the local asla ibud, our tree is not going to waste. Aser. Ela drabanan kashu. We still have a problem with the Rabbanan contradicting themselves. Why is it that in this case, in our Mishnah, the Chachamim say there is no problem with Zevezagorim, whereas when it comes to the grinding up the Avoda Zara, they say it is a problem. The Gemara says epoch. We're going to have to just flip around our Mishnah and say there must have been some mistake in the way that we learned our Mishnah. We knew that this discussion happened. We knew that there was a discussion between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi. We must have just mixed up the way it goes. Now, we never like to give this taras because we have a Mishnah. We know that our Mishnayos are carefully written out. And that's why the Gemara is going to give a number of other answers. Now, I'm just going to point out a couple of things. The fact that the Gemara, Tosfos has a problem on our Mishnah, which is that even if you go back, why does Rabbi Yossi only wake up about Zevezagorim at the end? Look at the beginning. Let's look at Tosfos. It's the last wide line at the top for skinny lines. It's Pirush ben Shmuel mikomakom asri rabbanan yerakos b'mosachama delo dami dahacha. Let's just think for a second. What do the Chachamim say? The first line in the Mishnah, what do they say? They say you're not allowed to go ahead and plant vegetables under a tree in the summer. Why? Because the tree is going to protect it from the sun. Now hold on. If you are of the opinion that zevazek gorim is permissible, is shade sufficient to produce a vegetable? No, it has to be connected to the ground. It has to receive nourishment from the ground. So if you're of the opinion that zevazek gorim is permissible, that two forces coming together to produce a result is not a problem, why don't we just say the vegetable is receiving its nourishment from the ground, and it's getting some protection from the shade. Add those two together, zeh vazeh gorim, and it's mutter. That's Tosfos' problem. Now Tosfos says a fundamental principle over here, which is very important to understand about zeh vazeh gorim. He says, if you go a few more lines down in Tosfos, he says, Avol gorim ditzel chayshinon, why shekulo aser sheosa hana shatzel osa lahagein minachama ein hakarka osa. It's an interesting thing. In other words, even if you're of the opinion that zeh vazeh gorim is going to be permissible, that's only when we're talking about two things that are doing the same job. In other words, we recognize that a plant needs a lot of things for it to grow properly. It has to be planted in good soil. It has to have the proper amount of sun and shade. It has to have the proper amount of water, not too much, not too little. A lot of things have to be done. It has to make sure it's protected from insects. A lot of things have to be done to make sure your plant is going to grow. We don't say that you take all those things together and then say if one, two, or maybe three of them are problematic, but you added in another one of those things, which is Isser, say, yeah, just add it all up together and call it zeh vazeh gorim. Each individual force that brings this thing to its fruition has to be permissible or a combination of something which is permissible and not permissible. So for example, in our case of the Mishnah, 100% of the ground is heter, is permissible. That's fine. 100% of the shade is a problem, is Avoda Zara. Now, if you were going to take two things together, ground of Isser and ground of Heter, that's zeh vazeh gorim. Shade of Isser and shade of Heter, that would be zeh vazeh gorim. But to say you have ground, which is permissible, and shade, which is prohibited, and just lump them together as zeh vazeh gorim, that's not how it works. Now, the simple logic behind it is that the idea, if the Ran writes this, the zeh vazeh gorim works with the mechanics of bittul. We're familiar with the concept of nullification, of when you have something which is going to be added together, you say bittul. Now, exactly how it works with bittul in a case like this, it relies on it being a drabanan and chad betray. But ultimately, the bottom line is that it's going to be it works with the mechanics of bittul. So therefore, you have to have something in that realm which is heter. That's point number one. And point number two, in our Gemara, it told us that Rabbi Yossi is going to say that zeh vazeh gorim is a problem when the item is still there, but when it's holech le'ibud, when it's being destroyed, it's not a problem. That's how we settled that contradiction. Rashi explained that the way that works is when the guy is grinding up his Avoda Zara and spreading it to the wind, he's essentially nullifying his Avoda Zara. Tosfos disagrees. If you go to the next Tosfos, Dibra Maschal, Hasam, you go all the way at the end, 4 lines from the end, L'chei nir l'faresh, it seems that we should explain as follows: the ka'az le'ibud, the lo shchiach sheyavo lezibol bezriya l'ruach. Says Tosfos, it's not a matter of the Avoda Zara being nullified, rather that it's not going to produce the result you're looking for. When a person takes an Avoda Zara, grinds it up into a bunch of pieces, and then throws it into the wind, it's so insignificant that it can't really actually produce any worthwhile result. That's why the Gemara says, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi is concerned. Why? Because you have a bunch of leaves that are coming off the tree, and they will decompose and be a positive fertilizing agent. However, when it comes to the case of like a person grinding up his Avoda Zara and spreading it in the wind, it's so insignificant that doesn't really make a difference. Now let's get back to the Chachamim. Let's go back to the Chachamim. First, our first attempt to answer the contradiction between the Chachamim and and themselves was just to switch it around. We just flipped the Mishnah. But like I mentioned, we don't like to do that. If we want, we could suggest the following. Lo tepach, don't flip it around. And Rabbi Yossi Kedishanina. We already settled Rabbi Yossi. Our Mishnah is a problem because everything is still here, and the previous Mishnah is also not a problem because that's holech leibud. Now the Rabbanan Keda Amar Rav Mori Breder of Kahana. We're going to settle the Rabbanan by applying a concept that was introduced to us by Rav Mori Breder of Kahana, which is in Maseches Tamura, which is Mashamash Biach Ba'ar Pogim Bebasar Hachanami Mashamash Biach Benevia Pogim B'Tzel. Now, just to give some context, Rashi explains to us what's going on over here. There's a halacha that if you have a carbon that becomes pasul, so what they do is they allow it to get a mum, to get a blemish, and then they sell it. Now, after the animal dies, there are two ways of skinning it. If you skin it from the feet first, you have the ability to pull off the entire hide in one fell swoop, and the hide will be worth much more. I don't know how to do it, but apparently when you pull it from the feet, you're able to pull off the whole thing, and the hide would be a complete hide, and it's going to be worth a lot more. Whereas if you do it the other way around, it breaks into a few pieces. That's my understanding. The problem just is that when you do it from the feet, it requires a lot more butchering of the meat. So the meat loses its value. So the Mishnah says you can't do that because you ruin the meat. Now the Gemara wants to know, hold on, why can't you do it if it makes, it's in other words, it's bizayin kachim, it ruins, it's a desecration to something which is consecrated. Therefore, you can't do it from the feet because it ruins the meat. The Gemara says, who cares if I'm ruining the meat? I want to make money for the Beis HaMikdash. I want to sell a nice, good hide. So the Gemara answers by saying, you're right. What you benefit by getting a more valuable hide, you're going to lose by having a messed up piece of meat. So therefore you can't do it. In other words, the concept of yatsa schara b'hafseda. Sometimes you'll benefit on one side, but in the process of benefiting on one side, you're also going to lose out on the other side. It's the concept of balancing it out, equaling it out. Now that's just what that term means. Mashmash biach ba'ar pogim b'basar. What you're benefiting in the skin, you're going to lose in the meat. Hachanami, in our case, mashmash biach b'nevia pogim b'tzel. The Gemara says yes. You are right in telling me that these leaves are going to fall down and they're going to decompose and become fertilizer. But whatever you're benefiting from the additional fertilizer that you're getting from these leaves that decompose, you're losing out from the sale. So you have a sum total of zero benefit from these leaves. You're right. Technically, you could say they became fertilizer and they added some nutrients to the fruit, but guess what? You're still going to have a bunch of fruit that didn't grow well because they were growing in shade. So therefore, the Chacham say, I'm not concerned about that type of benefit because there is no net benefit that you get from it because at the end of the day, the shade still ruined it. And that's why in our case, the Chacham say there's no problem with Zevaz Agorim because nothing's really benefiting from the benefit of the fertilizer. The Gemara says, hold on a second. Let's just challenge this whole premise. The Savar Rabbi Yossi Zevaz Agorim Aser. Is it even true that Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that if you take two forces together to produce a result, it's a problem? Can't be. Vatnan, we learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Omer, Notin Yichor Shel Arla. It's permissible for a person to plant a branch of Arla. What's Arla? The first 3 years that a tree is in its existence, you are not allowed to benefit from the fruit. However, you're allowed to benefit from the tree. So the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, you're allowed to take off a branch from a young tree and plant that branch by itself. Einotin egos arla, you're not allowed to plant the walnut of Arla. Why? B'neshu pri. The egos is an actual pri. You're not allowed to benefit from. You're not allowed to eat that pri. You're not allowed to benefit from it. So you can't plant it. But Amar Amarav, Rabbi Yossi agrees if you did it, she'im notav, v'hivrach v'herkev, you planted this walnut, or you did some type of grafting, mutter, you're allowed to benefit from the fruits that grow from it. Why would that be? Because Zevaz Agorim. In other words, there's a few other forces. It's not just that one walnut. But V'tani nami hachi, we learned similarly, Rabbi Yossi agrees, she'im not the top of them Tesam Aleph, Shimnata, if a person planted this fruit, v'hivrach v'herkev, or did some type of grafting. Now this is really relevant to know if you're going to graft an old tree and a young tree, which age do you follow? Do you say that this is essentially a young tree and you have to wait out its years for it to actually finish the arla? Or do you say it's part of the old tree? Halacha is, mutter, it's going to be permissible. Again, what do you see? Then according to Rabbi Yossi, when you have a zev zegorim, you have an old tree and a young tree, you put them together. What's the halacha? You follow the old tree. Why zev zegorim is going to be permissible? Now the chitema, you might suggest you're right. It's true. Rabbi Yossi does say that when it comes to arla, we're going to say zev zegorim, it's going to be permissible. You're right. There's a difference between Avoda Zara and other Yisurim. Avoda Zara is one of the three cardinal sins. It says you have to be very careful. You can't even own a little bit of Avoda Zara. So maybe in such a case, we'll say that Zev Zegorim is going to be usher. That's how we explain Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. But in other cases, he'll say it's permissible. And the Gemara says the problem is, is it true that there's a difference? But Tani, we learned in the Brisa, you have a field that was fertilized with fertilizer of Avoda Zara. You have a cow that became very fat because you fed it these these kernels of Avoda Zara. In one place, in one Mishnah, Tani Chada, one place it says Sadat Hizara. You can go ahead and you could plant in that field, no problem. Why? Because again, the fertilizer is not the only force. You mix it together with the ground, it's to be permissible. Para tishachet, you can go ahead and slaughter the animal and make a barbecue. Tani Idach, we learned in another brisa, Sada Tavar, no, you can't benefit from it. Rather, the field is going to have to sit there fallow until that fertilizer is going to be ineffective. Upara Tiraza, and the cow is going to have to become skinny. You have to put the cow on a diet to get all the benefit of those karshinim, of those kernels that it ate. So now you have clearly two different opinions. Now we don't know who's the author of these two different opinions. So the Gemara says, you know what? Let's try to attribute them to names that we're familiar with. Mailav, let us assume, Rabbi Yossi Harabanan. The one that says that it's a problem is Rabbi Yossi. Sorry. The one who says it's a problem are going to be Rabbi Yossi. No, because we're at this point, we're still saying that Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that Zev Zegorim is going to be a problem. So it's Rabbi Yossi, and the other one's going to be the Chachamim. In other words, the machlokas over here, whether you have to put the cow on a diet or leave the field fallow, that is the machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. And what do you see? This is clearly a case of Avoda Zara. And who are we attributing the Mishnah who says it's mutter to? We're attributing it to Rabbi Yossi. So you see clearly that Rabbi Yossi says, in any case, Zev Zegorim is going to be mutter. It's going to be mutter when it comes to Arla. It's going to be mutter when it comes to Avoda Zara. So now if that's the case, Rabbi Yossi consistently holds that Zev Zegorim is going to be okay, not a problem, then we have a problem with our Mishnah. Mor says, no, incorrect. Lo, ha Rabbi Eliezer. This is Rabbi Eliezer. It's not Rabbi Yossi. But ha Rabbanan, and this is our other Rabbanan. The Mor says, hi Rabbi Eliezer. Who is this Rabbi Eliezer? We can't just make up Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara says, hi Rabbi Eliezer. Who is this Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbanan. Hi Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan. Ilaim Rabbi Eliezer Rabbanan. This SAR. Let's suggest it is nachlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan when it comes to SAR. What's the discussion of SAR? So nowadays, I just know this from the various Hilchos Challah questions that I've been getting. It's very popular for people to be making sourdough bread. So you don't even have to explain this so much. But what is sourdough bread? What they do is they take a little bit of flour, they put it with water, they allow it to ferment for a long time. You keep feeding it and feeding it and feeding it, and it basically lasts forever. And you put a little piece into your bread, and it acts as your yeast. So that's what happens over here. Hi, the Tanan. Sa'ar shachulin. You have sa'ar, the sourdough of chulin, again referring not to the sourdough bread, but to the actual starter. You have the sa'ar shachulin, this starter of chulin, v'shal truma. Now chulin is permissible to be eaten by everybody. Truma can only be eaten by a kohen. Now what happened was you have both of them, truma and chulin, shenaflu tochis. They fell into a dough. Now interestingly, says the Gemara, lo bazek telechametz, v'lo bazek telechametz. There wasn't enough of this starter of either chulin or truma to cause the dough to rise. But if it's starfu, the chulin and the truma got together, then it's starfu, and V'chimtsu, the dough rose. So now what's the halacha? Can a regular yid eat it? In other words, it has chulin in it, which is permissible for everybody to eat. Has truma in it, which is only permissible for a kohen. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Achron aniba." I follow the last one that fell in. So, if the last starter that fell in is going to be chulin, a Yisrael could eat it. If it's truma, then only a kohen could eat it. Chachamim say, "Bein shnaf isel lechatchila, bein shnaf isel lebasof, any as achi teheba k'dil chametz." Say the Chachamim, no, it has to be that each one has enough for it to rise. If not, you combine them together, it's not a problem. So clear was what Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that it depends which one fell first, which one fell second. Now, here's the key. For Amar Abaya says, Lo Shana, where did Rabbi Eliezer say that if the second one to fall in is the chulin, then it's permissible for everybody to eat? Ela shekadam v'silek es iser. If you first removed whatever sourdough starter that fell in. So if you have truma that fell in first, and then you quickly pulled it out, and you can't get all of it out, you get most of it out, and then afterwards the chulin fell in. So says Rabbi Eliezer, in such a case, the truma fell in and you pulled it out. Now, it does have some effect on the dough, because remember, if it fell in and you took it out and it has no effect on the dough, there's no question over here. The whole question is whether combining them together, we have chulin and truma together, they join forces to create a problem. Is it a problem? So says Abaya, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, that if the chulin fell in second, it can be permissible. That's only true if you took out the truma. What do you see? Clearly, zev zegorem is a problem according to Rabbi Eliezer. So that's the opinion that says you have to put the cow on a diet and you have to leave the field fallow. Avalo kadam silicus iser aser. Now the Gemara says, hold on a second. You're going to attribute this Mishnah about Zevaz Agorim to Rabbi Eliezer because of Abaya? We might the time of Rabbi Eliezer Abaya. Who says Rabbi Eliezer actually follows Abaya's rationale? Maybe that's Abaya's opinion. Maybe simply he holds what he said, which is I follow the final one. And he explains. Asura. If the final blow that gave it the ability to rise was something which is prohibited, it's prohibited. If it got finished off, the heter, then it's going to be permissible. And guess what? Not like Abaya, rather, bein salke, bein lo salke. It makes no difference if you took it out or not. It's always going to be dependent on which one came in second. So the Gemara says, okay, so that Rabbi Eliezer clearly has nothing to do with Zev Zegorim. We had a nice discussion over here about sourdough bread, but it has absolutely nothing to do with what we just talked about. So now we're, again, trying to figure out who is going to be the author of the brisa that teaches us that you may have to either leave your field fallow or cause an animal to lose some weight. Ella, Rabbi Eliezer's Rabbanon de Eitzim. This is the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon of Eitzim, which is actually a Mishnah we're going to learn in a few minutes today. The Tanakh says in the Mishnah, Daf Metesam days, not al Heyman, a person took from an Atzei Asherah, Eitzim, he took some wood. Asura bana, you can benefit from that wood. Hisik ben satana. What happens if you use that wood to light a fire inside your oven? Halach is chodash yutatz, yashan yutza. We'll get to this later today, but basically, on an earthenware oven, the very first time that you're going to fire it up, it's not only firing it up for the sake of using it, but it's critical for the survival of the oven. The heat causes everything to fuse together in a way that it stays together. So now you build this oven, you install it in your house. The way it works is you have to fire it up with a good heat the first time. That heat that you put into the oven causes the oven to last. So if you put Atzei Asherah, you put Avoda Zara into your oven for the very first time, guess what? Your oven from here on in is going to be in survival mode. Why? Because of the Avoda Zara. So every time you're going to use it, it's going to be using the effects of Avoda Zara. Therefore, Chadash, Yutat, you got to smash the thing to pieces. Yasham, if it's an old oven, so then what's the problem? The problem is you have heat from Avoda Zara, Yutzan, cool it down. You just can't use it anymore. Now, Afabasapas, what if you actually bake bread in that oven with that heat from Avoda Zara? Asurabana, you can't benefit from that bread. Those loaves of bread got mixed up with other loaves of bread, cool and Asuras, all of them going to be problematic. Bahana. Blazer says, Yolach Blazer comes up with this clever idea, which is, what are you worried about? Benefiting from Avoda Zara? All right, how much was that worth? One branch? $5? Okay, take $5, bring it to Yam Melech, dump it in the Yam Melech. You officially redeemed your Avoda Zara, and everything's going to be okay. Amrullah, the respondent said, no, ain't pinning Avoda Zara, you cannot redeem Avoda Zara. This is not going to work. So here we have the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, where essentially, look how Rashi says this. This is in about the seventh wide line. Anytime you're going to have any bread from this oven, it's going to be Zevaz Egorim. In other words, the Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah, we're going to have in a few minutes, he's of the opinion that Zevaz Egorim is also because you're not only benefiting from that one piece of wood, there's other wood in there, so it's Zevaz Egorim, and it's going to be, he says it's a problem, you have to redeem it. Gemara says, but hold on a second. Who argues with Rabbi Eliezer? Let's just see this. Rabbanan depligi Rabbi Eliezer maninu. Who's going to argue with Rabbi Eliezer and say it's permissible? In other words, you're going to try to propose that those previous Mishnayos are dependent on machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan have to be the ones who are mekel. The problem just is, they're even more stringent. There's nobody who says it's permissible. Both of them agree that Zevaz Egorim is going to be a problem. The Chachamim just take it a step further and say you can't even redeem it. So how are you going to attribute that to that Mishnah? The Gemara says, you know what, rather, no, we made a mistake. El Rabbanan the Sa'ar. We're going back to the Rabbanan on Sa'ar that says that we're not worried about that because it gets mixed together. Anyway, the Shamal Rabbanan the Mekili b'Sa'ar, but what's called the Mekili? Again, how can you compare? Sa'ar has kulin, it's true, but who says you can compare that to Avoda Zara? Where it says rather let's go all the way back to the drawing board, all the way at the beginning. Ha Rabbi Yossi, ha Rabbanan. Forget Rabbi Eliezer. The discussion about these cows that ate Avoda Zara in the field that was fertilized with Avoda Zara. It's machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanan. Now, why that's a problem? Why? Because we tried to go ahead and say that there would be a difference between Avoda Zara and other things. Ultimately, the bottom line is we have a major stira. Because our Mishnah assumes Rabbi Yossi is the one who's machmer, says Zevaz Egorim is a problem. And the Chacham are the ones who say it's not a problem, but it doesn't fit, doesn't work. So Gemara says the following. But yet, let's go all the way back to the drawing board and let's reread our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi, l'divrei and Rabbanan, he was just responding to the Chacham. In other words, he was not actually giving his opinion. He said, Lidi di Zevaz Egorim mutar. I'm of the opinion that Zevaz Egorim is always going to be permissible, and therefore I have no problem with planting these vegetables in the winter months, even though the leaves are going to fall down. However, Lididchu, you are concerned with Zevaz Egorim. Why won't you admit to me and say to me, listen, you can't plant vegetables under these Asherah trees in the winter. Why? Because you're going to have fertilizer coming from the tree. Rabbanan will answer and say, no, we're not worried about it, like we said earlier, because it cancels itself out. In other words, let's just clearly just summarize what we learned this morning so far. Mishnah tells us that if you plant vegetables under a tree, if the tree is to the detriment of those vegetables, it's permissible. That's what the Chachamim say. Rabbi Yossi shows up and says, really? Is that really your opinion? And they say, yes, that's our opinion. And Rabbi Yossi says, don't you have a problem with Zevaz Egorim? They say, yes, we do have a problem with Zevaz Egorim. So then why are you allowing this person to plant these vegetables under the tree? So they say, well, it's under the tree, the shade is bad for it. But don't the leaves fall off and turn into fertilizer? And they respond and say, yes, it does turn into fertilizer, but that's not a problem because the detriment of the shade is so bad that the advantage of the fertilizer can't possibly make that up. That's not considered Zevaz Egorim, that's going to be permissible. What's the halacha? Amr Yehuda, Amr Shmuel, halacha Rabbi Yossi. We pass like Rabbi Yossi, the Zevaz Egorim is going to be permissible. We're running out of time, so maybe we'll get back to this at the end. But there are some fascinating halacha l'maisa questions with regards to Zevaz Egorim. Try to get back to it at the end of this year if we have some time. Hahu Ginza. This garden, it was fertilized with fertilizer of Avoda Zara. Shalach Rav Amram Kamed Rav Yosef. they sent a question to Rabbi Yosef. Remember, the halach is like Rabbi Yossi. Zev is a garden is going to be permissible, even though the field was fertilized with fertilizer of Zara. Nevertheless, you're allowed to plant in it. Why? Because Zev is a gorim is permissible. Top of Mutes, Amud Beis, brand new Mishnah. The Mishnah we just learned a few minutes ago. Not on a person took some wood from an Asherah tree, a surin ba'ana. You can't benefit from that wood because it's Avoda Zara. Hisik ben sataner. You went ahead and you flamed up your oven with it. Im chadash yutatz, like we explained earlier. If it's a brand new oven, you have to break it because that is what seals up the survivability of that oven. The im yashan, if it's an old oven, you'd just cool it down and then you could use it. Off of us pass. What if you actually bake bread with this Avoda Zara? Asura ba'ana, you can't benefit from that bread. This arva ba'cheros. What if those loaves of bread got mixed up with other ones? Kulun asuros. They're all going to be asur. The Hana, you can't benefit from any of those loaves of bread. Belezer says, Yolech Hana liyam melech. Just take the value of those logs of Avoda Zara, throw it into the Yam Melech, and then you could benefit from the bread. Amru lo, Chacham responded to him and said, no, you cannot redeem Avoda Zara. Not only meant a karkor. What if a person took a branch off the tree and he turned it into a karkor? Now Rashi says a karkor is a devilu balaz. I don't know what a devilu is, but it's some type of weaving tool. It's some type of weaving tool. I don't want to get into it because I'm not exactly sure what it is, but something that somehow separates the threads in different directions like this, you can continue weaving. Basically, it's a tool specifically used for weaving. You made it out of an Avoda Zara tree. Asur bahana, you cannot use that weaving tool. What if you actually use it to weave a garment? Asur bahana, you can't use that beged. And what happens if that beged, that garment, gets mixed up with other ones? And it continues getting mixed up. They're all going to be prohibited. What does Rabbi Lezer say? Rabbi Lezer says, take the value of that weaving tool, chuck it into Yam Melech, and then everything's going to be okay because you have officially thrown out that benefit. Amrullah, they responded and they said, "Ein pidyon la'avodas kechavim." You person cannot redeem Avoda Zara. Mitzricha. Why do you have to have both cases? Why do you have to have the case of a person taking wood and then putting it into the oven and then making a weaving tool? Diashmin k'maisa. If we only know the case of wood in the oven, b'hak amr v'lezer mishra debidin the kagamra pas kali yisura. An interesting idea. As you're benefiting from it, it's getting destroyed. So since you're benefiting from it and it's simultaneously getting destroyed, maybe in such a case, Rabbi Lezer will be a little bit more makel and say you could throw the value into the Yam Melech and it'll be okay. Karkor, the Isul, the Surah Ve'ena, it's still there. Maybe the Rabbanan will agree. So therefore, we said another case where it's not going to actually. Therefore, we have both cases. V'yashmin karka. What if you only said the other case where the item is still there? Maybe in such a case because the item is actually physically present and it's not going anywhere. That's what the Rabbanan say you can't redeem it. Maybe they're going to agree to Rabbi Lezer that since it gets destroyed at the time that you're using it, you're allowed to go ahead and redeem it. Tzricha, you have to have both cases. Amar of Chia Bre de Rabba Bar Nachmeni, Amar of Chista, Amar Ziri, Halacha Rabbi Eliezer. So we have this whole chain of Masor over here. They say Allah is like Rabbi Eliezer, and yes, you can redeem it. Ikad some say Amar of Chista, Amar the Abba Bar of Chista, Amar Ziri, Halacha Rabbi Eliezer. Just a question of how we got this Masora, because again, Masora, the tradition of how we found that Halacha is very important. Bottom line is, they both say the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, that you can redeem it. Amar Avoda Bar Ahava. Avoda Bar Ahava says, Lo shanu ela pas. Where does Rabbi Eliezer have his opinion that you can go ahead and redeem it? That's only when it comes to bread. Avol chavis, what if you have a barrel of yayin nesech, and that gets mixed up with other barrels of wine, a permissible wine? Halacha is low. Rabbi Eliezer is not going to say you can just redeem it and benefit from it. Richter says, even when it comes to a chavis, you just take the value of that one chavis, throw it into the Yam Melech, and then you could benefit from it. It doesn't mean you could drink it, it just means that you could sell off that wine to an akum. And the Gemara has a story. There was a guy, this a barrel of yayin etzech got mixed up with his other wine. Also, the commander of Richter, they came for Richter. Amar, he said, Shkol Arba Zuzi, he gave him a value of 4 coins. Shadi benara v'nishtrilach. Take the 4 coins, like Avoda says, chuck it into the ocean, and it will be permissible because you've officially gotten rid of that benefit, and you could benefit from that wine. Now, again, it doesn't mean you could drink from it. Rashi says very clearly it's mutar bahana. You could sell it to an akum, or you could use it for other purposes, but you cannot drink it. Keitzad mevatla. How does an akum go ahead and be mevatel his tree. So the Mishnah says kirsein v'zirei, different types of trimmings he could do to this tree. Not the makel, he takes a branch, a stick off of it, or sharvet, or some type of staff. Afilu, Allah, even a leaf or a branch, or raise a patela, it becomes batal. What happens if it's shifa? If he goes ahead and shaves down the tree. If it's the tzarcha asur, if it's for the sake of beautifying the tree, then of course it doesn't help, it's still asur. Shlo tzarcha, if it's not for its purpose, rather you're doing it to ruin the tree, then it's muteris, that's the way of actually nullifying the Avoda Zara. Gemara says, osun shafayim, when you shave down the tree, you're going to have shavings. Not the hayaleh. Are those shavings permissible, or are those shavings prohibited? Gemara says, Pligi bar Rav Huna bar Rav, Pligi bar Rav Huna Rav Chia bar Rav. There's a machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Chia bar Rav. There's a parenthesis over here. Say Vichia. Vichia bar Rav. Chalamar, one of them says, Asurin, Chalamar Mutarim. Some say that the shavings are going to be permissible, some say they're going to be prohibited. Tanya Command Amar Mutarim, we have a brisa like the opinion that says that they're permissible. The Tanya, for it says in the brisa, Oved Kochavim Sheshifa Vos Kochavim Litzarcha. You have an akum who went ahead, he shaved down the Avoda Zara tree, Litzarcha for his purposes. He v'shafea Mutarim. Both the tree and the shavings are mutar. Why? Because you, by doing that, nullify the Avoda Zara. Litzarcha, if it's for the sake of the tree, he asura, the tree still remains asur. Shafea, and the shavings mutar will be permissible. Yisrael, however, Yisrael, remember, we know that Allah is a Yisrael, a Jew cannot be mevatel on Avoda Zara. Yisrael, shashifa avodas kukavim, bein litzarcha, bein litzarcha, he shafea asurin. There's nothing that he can do to be mevatel on Avoda Zara. It remains Avoda Zara, so both the tree and the shavings are going to be prohibited. Okay, so basically, it's machlokes what the halacha is with those shavings. Gemara says, Itmar, what's the halacha with an Avoda Zara that broke? It just broke seemingly by itself. Rav Amar tzarach levatel. You have to go ahead and actually, the akum has to be mevatel it. What do you have to be mevatel? Kol kesim ukesim. Every splinter of the Avoda Zara needs its own bittul. Why? Now it's not one entity, it's a bunch of small entities. He has to go to each small piece and say, this is batal, that's batal, this is batal, that's batal, until everything becomes nullified. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, Avodas Kechavim Ein Betela Elog Derech Dilasa. Avoda Zara becomes batal as it grows. Now the Gemara says, hold on, Adrabba, that's not true. We learned the opposite. Derech Dilasa Bevatla, as a tree grows, it's become batal. What does this mean? We learned earlier that the natural process of a tree growing does not cause it to become batal. If leaves fall off of a tree, that doesn't make it batal. That's just the natural process. This is what he means to say. Avoda Zara only needs to be nullified if it's growing normally. In other words, since it's growing normally, therefore it needs to be nisbatel. Let's say that this is the machlokes. The first opinion says, Ovdin l'shavarim, an akum would go ahead and serve the broken pieces of Avoda Zara. There's a big Musar Haskell on this, but we're running out of time. Mar Savar, and Mar says, Ein Ovdin l'shavarim, they're not going to go ahead and serve the broken pieces. The Gemara says no. L'kuliyama, Ovdin l'shavarim. Everyone agrees that the akum will serve the broken pieces. We're talking about the broken pieces of the broken pieces, the secondary shatter. And that's what they're arguing about. One opinion says that the secondary broken pieces are asur. The other opinion says the shivish shvarim are going to be permissible. Now Rashi explains that part of this has to do with what we mentioned earlier, that the question is, does it become naturally broken? Because the akum is going to say, if my Avoda Zara couldn't protect itself from turning itself into a bunch of shattered pieces, so I should go ahead and serve it. It itself is broken. So that's the machlokas of it. Everyone agrees that broken pieces and broken pieces of broken pieces can be permissible. Here we're talking about Avoda Zara of chulios. It's different parts which fit one into the next. In other words, it's easily assembled and disassembled. So we're talking about a case where even a simple person, you don't need to have an uman, you don't have to have a craftsman go to put it back together. Marasavar, one opinion says, since a simple person, a DIY guy, can just simply put it back together, it's not batal. Marasavar, the other opinion is, Avodah Zara does not become batal. Rather, ela derech gedilasa, only the way that it grows, which means the hainu orche, the normal way. Halav gedilasa, if it's not the normal way, halav gedilasahi, if it's not going to be the normal way, the ein tzricha levatel does not need to be nispatel because again that's not normal. As Rashi explains, kishi eladerach gedilas kishi kayama could go neviad masnisin those cases. Avohach, the last line of Rashi before the end of the parak, lav hainu orche lipol. It's not normal for it to fall off and to fall apart, and therefore, because it fell apart in an abnormal way, therefore it's going to be batal. Hadron Allah kol hatzlamim. Have a wonderful day.